You know, the reality is that right now around the world there is famine, and that famine is eventually going to make its way into the Western countries. Hey guys, I'm trying to hide out underneath the shade by our pool today. It's going to be a whopping 96 degrees, which is going to totally wipe out the unofficial hottest days on record, July 3rd and 4th for us. I'm not sure what an unofficial hottest day on record actually means. If it's not official, then it still confuses me, because even 6 or 7 years ago in July, we had days that were getting up over 100. We haven't gotten over 100 this year. I need some wood to knock on, but you know, anyway, it's hot. I can't wait to jump in there later this afternoon. But I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about food prices, because I see some complacency with a lot of people where they just have gotten used to where the prices are, and you know, it is what it is. They're moving forward. People stop thinking about it. When people stop thinking about it, they get used to it. They adjust their pocketbook to pay for it. Then a lot of times what you'll see is people start slacking off in areas where they should be producing some food at home. And so this video is to offer some encouragement to those of you who are thinking about growing food on your own, or trying to grow food on your own, because I think in the future, in the very near future, you're going to see that this is more of a necessity, which is going, and as that happens, you're going to run into seed shortages and stuff. So getting yourself set up now is really important. And the prices that we're seeing in grocery stores and restaurants, they are substantially higher. They're higher than they were during the pandemic, believe it or not. And they've kind of stabilized, and they're about to shoot a lot higher. And I'm going to explain to you why they're about to shoot a lot higher in a couple minutes. Over the past couple years, you know, we have been traveling cross country. I guess I can say cross continent now, because we've been going up into Canada as well. And we've visited a lot of different farms. Most of these farms have been bison ranchers. And looking at the bison industry from that perspective is interesting, because we've seen a rather large sampling of a small industry to be able to see how, you know, the droughts and feed costs have impacted a small part of the meat industry. You could easily scale that up, because there are a lot of similarities to the overall beef industry. But even then, you know, when we talk about beef, there are some reports that I'm going to talk about that can also give you indicators of what's going on there. The other thing that we've seen as we've crossed the continent are the impacts of drought, on things like corn. If you guys remember, just last year I was sharing pictures of cornfield after cornfield after cornfield in Kansas completely dried out, wiped out. We showed in some of our videos where some ranchers had taken their corn crop and just turned it into silage because it wasn't useful for anything else. And this was just last year. And so we definitely had a major impact from drought conditions that kind of started with crops, made their way through the protein market. And even though this year I think we'll have better crops than what we've seen in the last couple of years, the increase in productivity from those crops isn't going to be enough to offset what we've already experienced, and it's barely going to be enough, I think, in my perspective, to keep up with demand. So the price pressure on things like grains and feed costs are going to continue to go up, and that's going to start next month, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Actually, let's talk about that right now, because this is important. I recently was ridiculed by somebody about the USDA numbers and my thoughts on USDA reporting of these numbers. And you have to understand, like, when it comes to government reporting of numbers, there are multiple motivations other than informing farmers of, you know, crop cycles and what to crop. It can have an impact on, you know, the market prices, so you have market manipulation in there. But it also comes down to our national security, right? So the Western states have to be food secure, because we get a lot of grains, we get a lot of things like rice from other countries. Ukraine and Russia actually provide us with a lot of fertilizers, a lot of grains. And if we were at war, which, I mean, it's very possible these days, but if we were at war with any of these countries and they wanted to cut off our grain supplies, you know, their timing of that would depend on how well we are, you know, because they'd have to be able to do it in a way that would be impactful. So if we were reporting very low numbers, it would make us susceptible to weaponization of grains and crops. So I'm not saying that they are or they aren't doing it, but what I'm saying is there could be some motivation there. But another thing that we've seen over the last couple of years is we've seen the ending stocks in their September revisions revise substantially down from the prior year. And those ending stocks have been dwindling every time they do that. And that's what I think is going to be a price driver this next month. And this price driver is going to impact grains across the board, in my opinion. I could be wrong, but I think it's going to impact grains across the board. I think we're going to see a revision in ending stocks to the downside again from last year. It was a very poor year. And that's going to change, again, the market's perspective of value of those grains. So right now, when it comes to things like bread, we're already paying way above what we did in COVID. You don't hear people talking about it as much anymore. It's like they don't care. I don't know what happened there. But, during COVID, people would complain. It's higher now. Beef is another one that's a lot higher, and beef is about to go through the roof because it's going to be impacted by these movements in grain. But the fact that the grain prices have been elevated for as long as they have, it's impacting feed costs for things like beef. It's impacting feed costs for animals across the board, poultry, pork, you name it. Now, I haven't really seen a whole lot of movement in the pork industry as far as, the herd size. So I'm not really concerned about pork at the moment, but if the feed costs remain that high, that's the main input for a lot of these pork producers. And if feed costs remain that high and pork prices don't move up a little more than they already have, I think we're going to start seeing some pork producers fold in the carts, and that will impact the herd size, or they're going to start reducing their herds. Something's going to give, I think, in the pork industry, but it's kind of, to speculate on that right now, I don't necessarily want to do, because it could correct itself and be fine for all I know. I mean, these things do happen. The poultry industry, we saw how the influenza affected poultry for a while, and I think that actually helped them with some of their input costs going up. You have seen some producers actually cut back on flock sizes in some of their chicken houses. Egg prices, shot through the roof and have come back down. And if you look at where egg prices are now, they're still elevated. They're still elevated substantially, but they're nowhere near as high as they were for a little while there. We had a few egg billionaires come out of the whole situation. But red meat is something that I think we need to talk about when it comes to beef and bison and things like that, because the beef industry in and of itself and the bison industry, what you saw last year was a lot of culling of animals. And the culling was due to an increase in feed costs, yes, but it mainly had to do with availability of forage. So with the drought conditions, you had a lot less forage out there. And the problem is the drought lasted for 3 years. Okay, and I'll get into what caused the drought here in a second, but it lasted for 3 years. The impact that drought has had on the land is actually pretty substantial. So anybody who's in farming or in agriculture knows that you have to give land a period of rest after grazing it to allow the land to come back. Well, the same thing happens with a drought. You kind of have to give it a period to rest for it to recover from the drought conditions, rebuild that root, strengthen that root base, and really get going again so that it's productive. You can't graze it as heavily as you did before. It would take several years just for the land to recover. Part of the reason why I think that beef prices are going to go up substantially, and I did a video on this at the beginning of the year, and I said that we needed to watch mid-year for the culling to stop, because the culling really still hasn't stopped, right? Part of that is, again, you've got the higher feed costs, and the other part is you still have these drought conditions on the land that will take some time with rain, with no drought, to recover that land. So they've got to keep a low stock on their land. A lot of farmers and ranchers have not started rebuilding their herd sizes yet. The price of beef is very attractive right now because we know that the herd sizes have shrunk. The availability of cattle for the meat industry has gone down. I think it's actually gone down 6 or 7%. That's driving prices up quite a bit. So overall, we've seen these beef prices remain elevated. So from a farmer's perspective or a rancher's perspective, cattleman's perspective, when you have some cows and you're going between the costs of holding on to those cows versus selling those cows for meat right now, it's still financially better to sell the cattle for meat than it is to retain them for replacements. And I say that because the cost of feed and the impacts on your land are still too great right now. That could shift, especially as we head into El Nino, that could shift over the next couple months. And what will happen when that shifts is that producers, cattlemen, will hold back cows for replacements. And what you'll see on some of those cattle reports is you'll see a decrease in the number of heifers and cows, female cows, going to slaughter. And you'll start seeing a significant imbalance between the steers and the heifers because they're retaining animals for replacement. And so when that happens, you'll start seeing the numbers of animals going to production or meat drop substantially. And if you're looking at the price in the grocery store now going, man, that's high, just imagine what's going to happen when the real holdback begins and the culling stops. Because almost every cattleman in this country is going to retain cattle for rebuilding their herds. That's the way the cycle works. I think that this cycle is much bigger than other cycles that we have ever seen, and I think the impacts on the supply chain will be more substantial than anything else we've ever seen throughout history. This could be a good time for meat, for producers, because their animals are going to go up in value. It could also be a very difficult time for some of the meat marketers because they're not getting the animals that they need to keep their businesses going. Same thing happens with the auction houses, although somebody's ridiculed me on that. It's just a numbers game. It's the way this stuff works out. Now, granted, the price of things is also going to go up, but we've already kind of seen the demand for some beef products already going down a little bit simply because of where the price is. Either way you look at it, the price is going to go higher. The demand is not going to wane enough to impact that, in my opinion, for quite some time. So we're probably going to see the cost of red meat go up substantially. Now, when beef prices do go up, that will have an impact on pork. And that's why, I say, the pork situation in my mind could correct itself. And that is, if beef prices go up soon enough before we really get into a problem with the cost of feed and raising pork, a lot of the pork producers will step in and meet that lower price demand that would be that gap that beef is going to make, and that'll drive pork prices up. And the same goes for chicken as well. So really, across the board, the protein industry looks like it's got a bright future as far as pricing goes. For the consumer, not so bright. And that's why I do some of these videos, is to alert you to it, make you aware of it. Now would be, even if you started doing this last year, you started buying quarter cows, you've probably already saved money. If you look at the price of meat over the last couple of years, just going up, going up, going up, going up. If you bought a quarter cow and at a certain price point, and you ate off that quarter cow for 6 months, then you went and bought another quarter one, it's gonna be a lot more expensive after 6 months, but you've actually saved money from that incremental spend versus going to the grocery store week after week. I think another major impact that we're gonna see in the grain markets is fairly similar. Last month we saw India ban exports of certain rice products. That's been driving the price of rice up globally. Now, as Western countries, we don't always think about this because we feel we kind of get in our comfort zone, and we're able to purchase these products even at higher prices. But globally, there are people starving right now because they can't afford to compete with us for the prices of some of these products. Rice is one of those more recent stories where the price of rice has been skyrocketing because India, which is one of the largest producers of rice, has stopped exports. So what's going to happen there is that's going to add to the overall grain phenomenon of basically people looking for other grain sources, cheaper grain sources, and it'll drive those prices up as well. So this is the cycle that we're going to start seeing, And these prices that have felt like they've stabilized, some of them have stabilized substantially higher than others, they're about to get another major lift. And I think when it comes to at least the protein industry, it's going to be a substantial lift. I'm not sure, where we're going to go with grain. It's going to depend on how long, India holds back on rice exports. But that alone, if you look at how many people in the world alone rely on rice as a grain resource, and that demand switching to other grain resources because they got to eat something or starve. A lot of them have been starving. It's going to end up impacting the entire grain market across the board. The reality is that right now around the world there is famine, and that famine is eventually going to make its way into the Western countries. We have the benefit at the moment of being able to buy these things, store food away, and I would suggest that you go ahead and do that because it doesn't look like the situation is going to get any better. And I think this goes back down to why the drought occurred in the first place, because that seems to be the biggest driver. It was a bigger driver in current prices than the pandemic or the war in Ukraine. And the reason why we had the drought conditions that we had is we had 3 years of back-to-back La Niñas. Now, there are some interesting studies. These are official studies that have studied, what causes some of these La Niña events to occur, okay? And so what they've determined is that it's the termination event of the solar cycle that actually triggers a La Niña to occur. I think that it was like 1 in 5,000 of a chance that a La Niña did not occur at the same time as one of these solar termination events in the solar cycle. And these studies are interesting because the more that we get into them, the more that we can realize how much the sun actually does impact climate cycles and weather on Earth. I'm saying climate cycles because I feel like, climate change means something else. And for me, to study climate change with the resources we have today, we only have like 25 years of satellite record or 50 years of satellite record. You'd have to study at least 100 years or more to really understand any changes in climate. But when we talk about climate cycles and weather, we could actually study some of these cycles because they're 22-year cycles, 10-year cycles, 11-year cycles, whatever it is. And we can kind of pinpoint, and see when these events occur. That and we have a significant amount of history to be able to determine, when we had La Niña events, when we had El Niño events. And my point is that they've pinpointed this solar minimum termination event as the start of La Niña cycles. There have also been similar studies, although they aren't, I'll admit, as far along yet, but even with my own observations, La Niña tends to occur more during minimal solar activity when the sun is not at its peak. So right now this year the sun's been acting actually fairly erratic. The sunspots have peaked out higher than they anticipated they would during the entire cycle, and it's actually given some people some concern to think. And I say this concern because it would align with what I'm trying to explain to you. Concerned to think that the peak of the current solar cycle may happen this year or next year instead of 2025. That means that we would have an earlier peak in the solar cycle. And if that happens, we may see a prolonged drop back down to minimum. And that would be indicative of solar cycle 26 being just a little bit of a blip on the map. And that's important because there are many different scientists with many different theories on this, and they all, nobody is exactly perfect, right? The science is more or less hypothetical theory. You have to measure it through observation, at least the science I grew up understanding. Today, they don't require observations of things. You can come up with a theory and just test it on the public. Anyway, the theory is that we would be heading into a longer term minimum period. So if La Niñas occur more often, if it becomes the dominant force in the Pacific Ocean, when you're in extended periods of minimum solar activity, then the events that we've seen, the 3-year La Niña cycle, would become more frequent. even if you just had a La Nina and then an Enso neutral period and then an El Nino and then a La Nina, maybe another La Nina, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be back to back like it just was to cause chaos when it comes to crops and growing food. So my point is that as we look at this year as a potential year to recover somewhat on crops, if we do in fact reach a peak, we may only get about 2 good years of growth before we immediately start going back down into a cycle that seems to be difficult to grow crops, difficult to forage, difficult to manage. Now, I'm sure that we will adapt because people always adapt, but we often forget about the fact that we've gone through several decades of optimal growing conditions. And if we go into a period of time where those optimal growing conditions are no longer prevalent and we have to deal with more years of less than optimal growing conditions, that's going to have a significant impact on our food supply and therefore the prices that we're paying for food. Because ultimately, the price is going to help increase and decrease the demand in the marketplace. I mean, if people can't afford it, there's going to be less people buying it. And so all of those market mechanisms will start to change a little bit. The period of time where food was really cheap and you could expense a lot of food and energy into other things is going to be going away if this actually happens. And like I said, it looks to me and I've done some videos on this in the past, it looks to me like solar cycle 25 started out pretty strong. And if it peaks in 2023, 2024, I think that it actually confirms going into a period of minimal solar activity in 26, possibly 27, 28. And if that happens, we're gonna have a food security issue on the planet that's worse than what we have right now. And right now we have 2.3 billion people, according to the UN, that are in famine. They're starving. We've got billions of people on this planet that are starving, and that will eventually make its way back into the Western world. My concern is, people don't want to take this into their own hands. It's too much work. It's not convenient to go out and grow your own food, to produce your own food. So they're going to continue to do whatever they can to just be able to go to the grocery store and buy it, which is fine. I mean, you're supporting farmers somewhere on that line, right? In theory, anyway. Might be supporting a few labs. But the concept is to just try and work and work and work and work and not necessarily set yourself up by investing in some land, by investing in learning how to garden and grow your own food. And there's going to be a time, I think, in the future where you're going to have to try and figure out a way to offset some of your food costs, if not all of them, depending on your situation, to be able to afford just to eat. And so that's one of the reasons why I do these videos, is to, bring people up to speed with what's going on. You don't hear a lot about food prices right now, but the reality is they're higher than they were during the pandemic on a lot of things. Food inflation continues to go up. There seems to be no end in sight. Beef prices are about to go through the roof. I mean, there's nothing we can do about that. We know it's coming. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody that trades commodities, they all know that the fact of the matter is that beef prices have to go higher, right? So, and that's going to have an impact across the board on protein. And like I said, what's going on with rice, what's going on with grains in Ukraine, if we have another bad growing year, another thing you have to keep an eye out for with El Niños is too much water saturation. Then you have no plant scenarios or no harvest scenarios. We have entered a period of time where it seems like the sun is a little less stable than what it has been. It's nothing unusual for the sun. It's done this before, but it's unusual to us because we haven't experienced it in a very long time and our population has grown significantly. What's going to happen when people can't afford food anymore? What's going to happen when people don't take the initiative to grow their own food? I mean, you saw how people reacted over gaming systems in New York City. Imagine that being a hungry crowd. It gets a lot scarier. You need to pay attention to this stuff. You need to take action now to set yourself up. It's not a bad investment. I mean, if you had started a couple years ago, back in 2018, when I started doing some of these videos on food security, if you had started growing your own food and offsetting your grocery bill with what you could do on your own, you would be financially much better off today than you were back then when you started, for sure. Because look at the cost of food and how it's gone up over time. If you had started putting food away or buying, quarter cows from your local farmer, again, you'd be financially better off today. Like it's an investment that has paid off for you already. So this type of advice isn't bad advice, even if nothing ever happens. I mean, we always hope that nothing ever happens that's terrible. But the trend continues to the upside. It has continued to the upside for several years on a lot of these necessities. And it's moving a lot faster than it had been for decades, which means the dynamic is changing. There's another event that I'm going to talk about maybe tomorrow or the next day that's coming up that's going to impact the US dollar, which is going to further exacerbate the situation, right? And if those changes occur, we may be the ones that can't afford the grains. We might be one of those countries that can't afford the grains to buy the grains anymore. So even as large producers, it's going to change our dynamic in the global trade system dramatically, which is going to change things for you at home. It's going to change how much an electronic costs. It's going to change a lot of things in your life if this actually happens. So we'll discuss that in the next day or two. But I just wanted to readdress this situation and help people understand a little bit about the market dynamics and what's going on, especially when it comes to beef and that industry, because the prices are going to go higher. They have to. They have to, because the supply is not going to be there. We're still culling cows, and yet we're down 6 or 7% in production. The supply simply is not going to be there in about 6 months. And when they revise those grain ending stocks next month, you're gonna start seeing some price movement to the upside in grains. The only thing that would push the prices lower is if we start getting good reports on some of the crops coming in. And while I think that those are definitely going to be better than they have been the last couple of years, they're not going to be anything that would impress traders to the point that you're going to really see a whole lot of downward pressure on grains. So the costs of feed and all these things that are going to be driving this restriction in the protein markets are going to strengthen, I think, starting next month. And that's also going to push more people off to the side. It could keep the culling going a little bit, but once we get past that period, the supply is gone and the price has nowhere to go but up.